had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and the idea of spending a few days alone in a remote cabin up in the mountains was the kind of adventure I craved. My phone had no signal out there, and the only way in or out was a winding, dirt road that barely counted as a path. I had everything I thought I'd need: food, water, a sleeping bag, and a couple of old camping lanterns. The idea was to unplug and experience solitude, something rare in a world that never stops buzzing. The cabin itself was exactly what I imagined. It was small but sturdy, with weathered logs for walls and a heavy stone fireplace in the corner. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a rough-hewn table, and a single bed tucked in the far corner. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for what I needed: peace and quiet, away from the noise of the world. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, the crackling sound of the wood filling the space around me. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but the cabin was snug and warm. I cooked a simple meal, read a little, and eventually crawled into bed. The quiet was thick, almost too thick. I'd been used to the constant hum of city life, the noise that never really let you forget that you weren't alone. Here, the silence was so complete it almost felt wrong. But that was part of the charm, wasn't it? I reminded myself that I was here to embrace that stillness. By the second night, the stillness began to feel less like peace and more like pressure. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was just off. I dismissed it at first, blaming it on the unfamiliarity of the surroundings and the quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, not thinking much of it. The cabin sat in a secluded valley surrounded by dense forest, and I figured the best way to get rid of the creeping unease was to stretch my legs. I bundled up in my jacket and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The ground was hard with frost, and my boots crunched against the frozen earth as I made my way down the narrow trail behind the cabin. The trees towered around me, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of overcast sky that made everything look flat and lifeless. As I walked deeper into the woods, the strange sensation that had settled in the pit of my stomach grew stronger. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to rationalize it. There were animals, right? Bears, deer, maybe even a mountain lion. But this feeling wasn't just the typical unease you get when you're alone in the wild. It felt more like something was watching me. I stopped for a moment, straining my ears. All I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant crack of a branch. My heart thudded in my chest, but I shook it off. I was overreacting. After all, I'd made this trip alone on purpose. I needed this. I needed to be here. I turned back toward the cabin and started walking faster, as if the urgency of my steps would shake the unsettling sensation that had started to settle into my bones. As I neared the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door, which I had locked before leaving, was slightly ajar. I froze. I was sure I had locked it. I always do. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, or maybe I had forgotten. I approached cautiously, keeping my hand near the small pocket knife I always carried. There was no sound coming from inside the cabin, just the wind outside, but the door was open far too wide for it to have been a casual mistake. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find nothing out of the ordinary, but as I stepped inside, I felt an immediate change in the air. It was colder than before, and the fire that had been burning when I left was now nothing but a pile of ashes. Everything else seemed fine, but that feeling of being watched was stronger now. I scanned the room quickly, checking for anything out of place. My eyes fell on the small wooden table, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There, on the table, was a small rock. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. It didn't belong. It was as if someone had placed it there deliberately, just to mess with me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind spinning. I kept telling myself that I was just imagining things. It was a rock, a stupid rock. But why would anything leave a rock on my table? I shook my head and tried to focus on the task at hand. I needed to stay calm. I lit the lanterns and made myself a cup of tea. But no matter how much I tried to settle my nerves, the sense that something was wrong only grew stronger. I went to bed early that night, my mind buzzing with questions I didn't have answers to. The silence outside seemed louder than ever, pressing in from all sides. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. The thought of leaving crossed my mind several times, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't leave. I had made this choice for a reason, and I wasn't going to let fear take over. But the next day, I knew I had to go. I didn't know why or how, but something deep inside me told me I wasn't safe here anymore. I packed my things quickly, barely thinking about the process. I kept my eyes on the woods, scanning for movement, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the trees. I didn't take the time to say goodbye to the cabin or the surrounding landscape. All I wanted was to get back to the road, back to the world I knew. The drive down the mountain felt longer than it should have. The dirt road, which had seemed so charming on my way up, now looked hostile and barren, like it was trying to keep me there. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the distance, following me. When I finally hit the paved road and the mountain receded behind me, I felt a wave of relief. I could finally breathe again. But as I passed the last curve, I noticed something strange. A figure stood in the distance, at the edge of the woods where the cabin had been. It was just a silhouette against the trees, barely visible, but something about it made my stomach lurch. It didn't move and it didn't seem to notice me, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. I drove faster, not daring to look back. When I got home, I locked the door and checked every window, something I'd never done before. I thought about the cabin, about the unsettling feeling I had felt there, and the rock on the table. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But a small part of me knew the truth. I had gone to the cabin to escape the world, but it wasn't the world I needed to escape from. It was something else, and I wasn't going back. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, the constant buzzing of notifications, and the unrelenting pace of everyday life. Just a quiet cabin in the woods, far enough from civilization to feel isolated, but close enough that I didn't have to worry about any real danger. I had found the place online, small, rustic, with a single bedroom, a wood stove, and a little porch that overlooked a lake. It was perfect. The drive there had taken longer than expected, but that was fine. The more time I spent behind the wheel, the more the city felt like it was slipping away. By the time I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched over the property. It was late fall, so the air was crisp and smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke. The trees were mostly bare now, their branches like thin fingers reaching out toward the sky. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, wooden and worn but charming, with a small porch and a couple of rocking chairs. There was a stone fireplace on the side, and the front door was a deep, faded red that had clearly seen better days. The whole place gave off a sort of nostalgic vibe, like it had been standing there for decades and had witnessed 1,000 stories unfold. I let out a sigh of relief, happy to be somewhere quiet. I grabbed my bags from the trunk of my car and made my way up the path to the door. The place seemed to have an odd stillness about it, but I figured it was just the peace of being out in nature, far from the usual hum of things. Inside, the cabin smelled a little musty, like old wood and pine needles. The air was thick with the scent of the fireplace, which was already crackling away when I walked in. There was no one else around, just me and the wilderness. The living room was simple: a couch, a small coffee table, and a few chairs. Everything had a slightly worn look to it, as though it had been used and loved but never really maintained too well. I was a little surprised to find that there was no Wi-Fi or phone service. I had expected at least some signal, but when I tried to check my phone, it just showed a single bar, then nothing. I decided to embrace the disconnect. No distractions, just the quiet of the woods and whatever I chose to do with my time. The first night was peaceful. I had brought some food with me, so I cooked up a simple meal and sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every now and then, a gust of wind would shake the trees, and I'd hear the crunch of twigs breaking in the distance. But nothing alarming. No strange noises, no sense that anything was out of the ordinary. But then, around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint scratching at the window. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a branch or some animal wandering too close. The wind had picked up a little, and the trees were swaying, so it made sense that something might have brushed the window. But then it came again, the scratching, this time a little louder. It wasn't like a wind-blown branch at all. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. My heart rate spiked as I lay there in the dark, trying to listen more closely. The sound was coming from the window on the left side of the cabin, the one that looked out toward the woods. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't some paranoid city person, but something about that noise didn't sit right with me. It was too consistent, too purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up from the bed, the floor creaking under my weight. I made my way over to the window, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the curtain. There was nothing outside. The ground was covered in a blanket of fallen leaves, and the trees stood tall and unmoving. The only thing that stood out in the dim light of the flashlight was a small pile of twigs, but nothing else. I let out a nervous laugh, feeling stupid for getting so worked up. It was probably just a bird or some other animal. I pulled the curtain shut and went back to bed. But the scratching continued. I didn't sleep much that night. The sound persisted for what felt like hours, and each time it stopped, I convinced myself it was over. But then it would start again, just enough to keep me on edge. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, the sun was up and the noise had stopped. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to enjoy the rest of my stay. I made some coffee, sat on the porch, and took in the view. The lake looked serene in the early light, with the fog rising off the surface and the mountains in the distance still shrouded in mist. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no reason to be scared. The wind, the animals, the isolation, it was all just part of being out in the wild. But then, things started happening that I couldn't explain. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the property, mostly to clear my head. The air was cold, and the ground was soft from the rain the night before. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I started to notice something strange. Footprints. Not human, but definitely recent. Large, wide, and uneven, like something heavy had passed through. The prints were too big to be from any animal I recognized, and they didn't follow any clear path. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that they were probably just from a deer or a bear. But the more I looked, the more they unsettled me. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but it didn't feel right. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the cabin, I noticed that the door was ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. My mind raced as I approached, cautiously, and pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin looked undisturbed, but there was a chill in the air now, colder than it should have been. I stepped inside and froze. There, on the coffee table, was my flashlight, the one I had used the night before. but it was turned on. I didn't know what to think. I didn't want to believe that someone else had been inside, but the evidence was right there in front of me. The door was open, the flashlight was on, and there were no other explanations. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the car, my hands shaking. I had to leave. Whatever was happening here, whatever had been making those noises, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I drove out of there as fast as I could, my heart still racing, the trees blurring past me. As I left the woods behind and the cabin disappeared from view, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. But something stayed with me, a nagging feeling that there was more to the story, that whatever had been watching me, whatever had been out there, hadn't just disappeared when I left. I never went back to that cabin, but I've heard rumors from others who stayed there. People say the same thing happened to them. Strange noises, things out of place, footprints that lead nowhere. They call it an old place, but there's something off about it. Something that lingers even after you leave. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad I never found out. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into a nightmare, but here I am, sitting alone in a dimly lit cabin in the middle of nowhere, trying to make sense of what happened. I had rented the cabin for a few days to escape the stress of work and city life. The plan was simple: get away, relax, and recharge. But now everything feels off and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. It started out as a typical trip. I packed my bags the night before. Clothes, toiletries, a couple of books, and my camera, hoping to capture some of the beauty of the forest. The cabin was about 2 hours away from the nearest town, deep in the woods. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I looked forward to it. The drive was peaceful, surrounded by nothing but trees and open land. The cabin itself was small but charming, tucked away in a clearing with an old stone chimney and wooden beams that gave it a rustic feel. It looked like something out of a postcard. I was excited as I pulled up the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires of my car. As I stepped out, the scent of pine and fresh earth hit me. Exactly what I needed. I unpacked my car and walked inside, greeted by the warm smell of aged wood and a hint of something else, something faintly musky, but I thought nothing of it. The place was cozy, with a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and a loft where the bed was. The windows were big, giving a great view of the surrounding woods. The cabin felt welcoming, untouched by time. The first evening passed without incident. I cooked a simple dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and spent some time reading by the fire. The night was quiet, too quiet, almost. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. I didn't think much of it, though. It was just the forest being its usual self, I told myself. But as I settled into bed that night, I noticed something strange. I kept hearing noises like scratching, faint at first, but it seemed to come from outside, maybe near the windows. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the wind moving branches or the house settling. After a few minutes, I drifted off to sleep, but the sounds persisted, keeping me on edge. I woke up early the next morning, the sun barely creeping over the horizon. The forest outside was covered in a thin layer of mist, giving it an eerie, almost dreamlike quality. I stretched and decided to go for a walk to shake off the lingering unease. The woods were peaceful, the trees towering above me, their trunks thick with age. The air was fresh, and I felt like I was the only person for miles, which, in a way, was exactly what I wanted. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I found an old, overgrown trail. The ground was soft under my boots, and branches reached out like arms, almost as if they were trying to pull me in. I hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged it off and continued down the path. The trail seemed to wind in circles, the trees becoming denser the further I went. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. About an hour into the hike, I found a small creek. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was soothing, but something about the place felt off. The trees were thick here, blocking out most of the light, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I crouched by the creek and took a drink from my water bottle, wiping my mouth as I stood up. That's when I saw it. A small clearing through the trees caught my eye. In the middle of it was something that shouldn't have been there. A patch of disturbed earth, the ground dug up in uneven, jagged lines like someone or something had been digging. I stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of it. There were no signs of any animals nearby, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the clearing. I didn't want to investigate any further, not without knowing what I was dealing with. My gut told me this wasn't just some random animal digging. This was deliberate, but I couldn't explain why I felt that way. I made my way back to the cabin, the sense of unease growing with every step. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and sat down on the couch, staring at the fire. The strange digging spot kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered in my thoughts, gnawing at me like a constant itch. That night, the scratching noises came again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They weren't coming from the windows, they were coming from the walls. I could hear it, faint but unmistakable, like claws or nails scraping against the wood. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. The noises continued, relentless, and then a soft thud, like something heavy had dropped onto the roof. My mind raced. It could have been a tree branch, I told myself, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains. The outside was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the moon, casting long shadows across the forest. There was nothing to see, no sign of movement, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't place. I turned away from the window, my nerves on edge. I didn't want to investigate further. I felt safer inside, even though every part of me screamed that I needed to leave. But where would I go? I had no signal on my phone, and the nearest town was miles away. The night dragged on in silence, but the fear lingered. I didn't sleep a wink. The scratching noises kept coming, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of that disturbed earth in the clearing. It haunted me, making me wonder what could be out there. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin another night. I packed my bags, my hands shaking as I stuffed clothes into my duffel bag. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but there it was, cracked open as though someone or something had been inside. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. There was no way I could have left it like that, but I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. I hurriedly closed the door, locking it again, and grabbed my keys. When I stepped outside, the world seemed too quiet. The wind had died down, and the forest felt suffocating, as though it was waiting for something to happen. My car was parked just outside the cabin, and the road was still winding, leading me back to the main highway. As I got into the car, I took one last look at the cabin. Something wasn't right, I could feel it in my bones, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. I drove away, the tires crunching over the gravel, the forest disappearing behind me. As I made my way down the long, winding road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the dark trees stretching into the distance. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The air was different here, lighter, easier to take in. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking as I filled up the tank. The attendant, an older man with a weathered face, glanced at me as I paid. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice rough. I didn't respond. Instead, I just nodded and left, getting back into my car and driving to a hotel. I needed to get some sleep, to let my mind settle. I thought about the cabin, about the scratching noises, the disturbed earth, and the feeling of being watched. It would take a long time before I could forget what happened out there. But as I lay in the hotel bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what was it that I had disturbed in those woods? What had been digging in the earth, and why had it been so interested in the cabin? I didn't have answers, but one thing was certain: I would never return to that place. I had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in Vermont, I spent more time in the woods than anywhere else. The sound of rustling leaves, the feel of cold mountain air, the smell of pine trees, it all felt like home. So, when a friend of mine mentioned a secluded cabin deep in the Swiss Alps for a weekend getaway, I didn't hesitate for a second. It sounded perfect. The cabin was in a spot so remote that GPS couldn't find it. That's how I knew it would be exactly what I needed. No distractions, no noise, just me and the forest. I packed up my gear, made sure I had all the essentials, and set off alone. It was a long drive to the base of the mountain, followed by a hike that took almost half the day. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear with just a touch of chill in the air. It wasn't too cold yet, but I could feel winter was on its way. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and pinks. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered wood with a tin roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. I could tell from the smell of the timber and the moss creeping up the sides that it had been abandoned for a while. A rusty old lantern sat by the door, but I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just part of the charm. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was cool, but not damp. There was an old wood stove in the corner, which would be perfect for the evening. I took a deep breath, appreciating the solitude. The place was empty, save for some old furniture covered in dust. A small table in the center of the room, a couple of chairs, and a rickety bookshelf were the only furnishings. The windows were fogged, so I couldn't see much outside, but the sky was already dark. I lit the lantern and set it on the table. The flickering light gave the cabin a warm, inviting glow, and I started unpacking my things. The firewood was already stacked by the stove, which was a relief. I didn't have to worry about chopping any wood. I set the lantern down beside the stove, stoked the fire, and sat back to enjoy the crackling warmth. After eating a quick dinner and washing up, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest surrounding it was dense and quiet, with the occasional creak of trees in the breeze. It felt peaceful, but there was something off. A strange stillness hung in the air, like the world around me was holding its breath. I couldn't quite place it, but I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed well-maintained, almost too much so. There were no fallen branches or overgrown patches. It was like someone had been through recently, clearing the way. The thought gave me an uneasy feeling, but I pushed it aside. Maybe the cabin was more of a local retreat than I realized. I spent a little time exploring, taking in the peacefulness of the forest, but eventually, I returned to the cabin. Night had fully fallen by then, and the moonlight barely pierced through the canopy of trees. I grabbed a book, settled into one of the chairs by the fire, and tried to relax. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, barely perceptible over the crackle of the fire. Tapping. It was so light, almost like the sound of a tree branch against the cabin's walls. I didn't think much of it at first, just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, this time louder. And then again, this time from the window. The tapping was rhythmic, like someone was knocking. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. There was no way anyone else could have made it out here. The trail was narrow and difficult, and I hadn't seen anyone else on my hike. I crept toward the window, trying to peer outside, but the glass was too fogged over to see anything. The tapping continued. It sounded like it was coming from all directions now, windows, walls, even the roof. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline flood my veins, and for the first time, I felt truly isolated. I grabbed the lantern and moved toward the door, but before I could open it, the tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to do. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Part of me wanted to leave right then, hike down the mountain in the dark, but something held me back. I'd come for solitude, for peace. I wasn't about to let some strange noise ruin it. I forced myself to sit back down, though my nerves were still rattled. I tried to focus on my book, but I kept hearing things. Tiny creaks, the shuffle of something just outside the cabin. It wasn't long before I couldn't take it anymore. I blew out the lantern and lay in bed, trying to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of wood, every rustle of the trees outside had me on edge. I tossed and turned, fighting the growing sense of unease in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. In the middle of the night, I woke with a start. The cabin was completely silent, and the darkness around me felt suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to return, and then I heard it, a faint shuffle just outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze, unable to move. The door creaked. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was waiting, watching. The door slowly opened, and I saw a figure standing there in the moonlight. But it wasn't a person. It was just a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to shift and bend unnaturally, like something that didn't belong in this world. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, staring at the shadow as it lingered in the doorway. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving me alone in the dark cabin. The silence returned, and the feeling of being watched persisted. I didn't dare move. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't going to sleep for the rest of the night. I spent the remaining hours wide awake, my mind racing with questions, my body trembling. What had I seen? Was it a trick of the light, or was there something out there, lurking in the forest? When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things, packed up, and left the cabin behind. The forest felt even more oppressive in the daylight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hike back down the mountain was long, but as I reached the bottom, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The world felt normal again. The sounds of the forest, once eerie, now felt like a comfort. I was out of the woods, out of the cabin, and I'd never come back. It wasn't until later, when I was safely back home in my apartment, that I found the real reason for the strange happenings. It was a letter, tucked inside the cabin's old bookshelf, hidden under a pile of old, dusty books. The letter was from the last person who had stayed there, written in a shaky hand. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The sounds, the feeling, it's like something's watching me. I've heard it too. The tapping, the shifting shadows. I don't think I'm alone anymore. That's when I understood. I wasn't the first person to feel that sense of dread, that suffocating presence. And I wasn't the last. I never went back to that cabin, but I often think about it, about the tapping, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the faint tapping, far off in the distance. I've always been the type to prefer solitude. There's something calming about being away from people, surrounded by nature. So when I got the chance to rent a small cabin in the woods for a few days, I jumped on it. The idea of being completely alone with no distractions was exactly what I needed. I didn't care that it was miles away from the nearest town or that the road leading to it was rugged and winding. I was looking for peace, and this cabin promised it. The cabin was old but charming, nestled deep in the woods. When I first arrived, the air was cool, and the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin itself was made of weathered wood, with a small porch and a single, lonely window on the front. It didn't look like much, but it had a certain rustic appeal that made it feel welcoming. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a small living room with an old stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a stove, a sink, and a table, and one bedroom with a bed that looked as though it had seen better days. There were a few books on a shelf, some old photographs in frames, and a couple of lanterns hanging by the door. It had a warm, homey feel despite its age. I felt comfortable there immediately, like I had been there before. The quiet of the place was soothing, and the only sounds I could hear were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. I spent the first day exploring the surrounding woods. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like something is lurking just beyond your sight, waiting. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I was here to relax, not to worry about imagined threats. As evening fell, I made myself dinner and sat in front of the fireplace with a book. The fire crackled, and I could hear the wind howling outside. It wasn't a storm, just the sort of gusty night that made everything creak and moan. After a while, I felt my eyes growing heavy, so I decided to call it a night. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint sound, something soft, almost like footsteps. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal passing by, but then the sound came again, louder this time. It was too consistent to be the wind. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to peer through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The forest was still, and the only light came from the faint glow of the fire inside. I tried to ignore it. The thought of someone else being out there seemed ridiculous. There were no other cabins nearby, and the road to get here was barely wide enough for a single car, let alone someone wandering around. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, and I went back to the fire. But the sound didn't stop, kept going, steady and methodical, almost like someone pacing back and forth just outside the cabin. My heart began to race. I tried to rationalize it again. Perhaps it was an animal or maybe a tree branch brushing against the cabin. But it didn't sound like that. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. But that didn't bring me comfort. Instead, a heavy silence settled in, thicker than before. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, like something is waiting for you to make a move. I grabbed a lantern and went outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to see for myself that there was nothing there. The night air was cold against my skin, and the trees swayed gently, but there was no sign of anyone. The ground was soft underfoot, and I could see the occasional shadow moving as the wind stirred the branches. The only sound now was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I walked around the cabin, checking every corner, but there was no one. Nothing unusual at all. Just the wind, just the trees that I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves, telling myself it was nothing. There was no reason to be afraid, but the uneasy feeling in my chest refused to go away. I went back inside, bolted the door, and sat in front of the fire, my mind racing. I spent the rest of the night staring into the flames, listening to every creak and crack from the old building. When I finally managed to fall asleep, I dreamed of being lost in the woods, wandering in circles, always hearing those footsteps behind me. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of my own breathing loud in the stillness of the cabin. The next day, I told myself that I'd overreacted. I'd gotten too caught up in the isolation and the silence. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head, to get out of the cabin and away from the strange feeling that had settled in. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through the dense forest. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, but the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned a corner or glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me. It wasn't until the afternoon that I realized how far I had wandered. The trail had faded into the trees, and I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by nothing but the quiet of the woods. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path was gone, replaced by thick underbrush and tangled roots. I was lost. I panicked at first, but then I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. I'd been on hikes before. I knew how to navigate. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the way I'd come, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the ground. It all blurred together in a dizzying haze. Hours passed, and the sky began to darken. My stomach growled, and I knew I needed to find shelter. I wasn't far from the cabin, I told myself. Just a little further, and I'd be back. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. Every step took me deeper into the woods, and every time I thought I was heading in the right direction, the landscape shifted, making it impossible to find my way back. By the time the sun set, I was fully aware that I was in serious trouble. I had no map, no flashlight, and no way of knowing how far off course I had gone. The forest around me seemed endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as panic started to set in. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, the sound of something walking in the leaves. My head snapped to the side, but I saw nothing. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the blood rushing in my ears. I wasn't alone out here. Something or someone was following me. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The footsteps stayed behind me, never getting closer but never fading either. They were there, always just behind me, and I was terrified of what might happen if I stopped. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing and caught sight of something familiar. My cabin. Couldn't believe it. I had made it back. I ran toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and finally reached the safety of the porch. That night, I didn't leave the cabin. I locked the doors and stayed by the fire, too scared to sleep, too scared to do anything but wait for the morning. The footsteps never came again, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after the fire burned out. When I left the next day, I didn't look back. The woods were beautiful, but they were also terrifying in a way that I couldn't quite explain. I don't know who or what was out there following me, but I knew that some places were better left alone. I had never been the type to seek out adventure, but there I was, standing at the edge of the dense woods, staring at a small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains. The place had a reputation, but I didn't care. I was looking for some peace, a weekend away from everything: work, stress, the noise of city life. I had rented the cabin from an old couple who had owned it for years, and after hearing about it from a friend who had stayed there once, I thought it would be the perfect escape. The cabin was tucked away on the side of a hill, surrounded by towering trees, their limbs like skeletal arms reaching up into the gray sky. It was old, built from timber that looked like it had seen better days, with a chimney poking up from the roof and a creaky porch. Still, it seemed solid enough. The air was cool, a light breeze rustling through the leaves. I could hear the distant sound of a creek gurgling somewhere further down the hill. I grabbed my backpack, feeling a slight unease in my stomach, though I couldn't tell if it was from the silence of the place or just the fact that I wasn't used to being so far from civilization. The cabin was supposed to be rustic, and from the look of it, they hadn't exaggerated. There were no neighbors, no other buildings within sight, and nothing to suggest that anyone had been around for days. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like old wood and dried herbs, but there was a comforting warmth to it. The fire in the hearth was already crackling when I entered, as though someone had been here recently. The room was sparse. A small kitchen, a couple of chairs, a table, and a set of old shelves lined with dusty books. The small windows let in a dim, gray light, but it felt cozy, like the kind of place where you could forget about the world. I set my stuff down and took a deep breath. This was going to be perfect. That night, after unpacking and lighting the fire, I sat on the couch, flicking through one of the old books. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The wind outside whistled softly through the trees, and the fire crackled. But other than that, nothing. I hadn't realized how noisy the city had been until this stillness settled around me. The darkness outside felt thick, pressing in against the windows. I must have fallen asleep early, worn out from the long drive. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, the fire now reduced to embers. The cabin was completely silent. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the crackling sound of the fire, if it had even been real at all. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could make out the faint outline of the room. That's when I heard it, a light thud. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The thud came again, this time a little louder, followed by the faintest of scratches, like something dragging along the floor. I sat up, trying to listen over the thumping of my heart. I told myself it was nothing, a branch scraping against the window, an animal outside, maybe even the house settling. But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I slowly got up, careful not to make a sound, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. My hands were shaking as I flicked it on and pointed it around the cabin. The beam of light cut through the dark, bouncing off the wooden walls, and then I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. At the far side of the room, near the door, there was a shadow. It was just standing there, motionless, like a dark shape in the corner. I couldn't see what it was clearly, but I could feel the weight of it, like it was watching me. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, slowly, until my back hit the wall. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was some trick of the light, but something about the way the shadow stood there. It didn't feel right. It felt wrong, like something was off. I flicked the flashlight off and waited, listening. The house was silent again, but the weight of the quiet made it worse. Every creak, every groan of the old timbers, every whisper of wind outside seemed louder than before. I spent what felt like hours lying there, the flashlight still gripped tightly in my hand, waiting for the morning. But when dawn finally broke through the small window, the shadow was gone. There was nothing there but the walls and the familiar stillness of the cabin. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that the stress of the drive had played tricks on my mind. I had no reason to be scared, but something about that night stayed with me. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area, to get some fresh air and clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, slung it over my shoulders, and headed out the door. The forest was thick and wild, with towering trees that made the ground below seem almost alien. I hiked down a trail that wound through the woods, following the sound of the creek in the distance. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of air you can't find in the city. But as I walked further, something started to feel off again. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched. Every time I stopped to take in the view or adjust my backpack, I would glance around, half expecting to see something. Someone, lurking in the shadows of the trees. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that my mind was playing tricks. But the feeling wouldn't go away. When I returned to the cabin later that evening, I noticed something strange. The door, which I had locked before leaving, was now slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was certain I had locked it. So why was it open? I walked inside, cautious, and scanned the room. Everything seemed in its place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been disturbed. I looked around the cabin, checking every corner, every window, every door. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The night came again, and with it, the quiet, oppressive darkness. I tried to relax, but every small sound in the night seemed magnified. My mind kept returning to the shadow I had seen the previous night, to the way it had been just there watching. I kept the flashlight close by, though I couldn't shake the thought that whatever it wasn't a simple trick of the light. It was too real, too deliberate. The scratching started again. At first, it was just a faint noise, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, like something was scraping along the floor, moving closer and closer. My heart raced as I sat frozen, listening. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was undeniable. It was coming from just outside the cabin door. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I knew that would be a mistake. The fire in the hearth had died down to just embers again, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Every sound seemed to echo. Every movement felt exaggerated in the quiet. Then there was a loud bang. I jumped, the flashlight falling from my hand. It clattered against the floor, the light flashing across the walls in chaotic patterns. I picked it up quickly, my breath coming fast, and slowly, cautiously, moved toward the door. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was about to happen. I stood there for a moment, listening, my heart hammering. Then I made my decision. I wasn't staying here another night. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and rushed out the door. My only thought was to get back to the car and leave. I didn't care if I had to drive all night. I just needed to get away from this place. But as I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped. There, in the clearing where the trees met the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a set of footprints, fresh ones, leading toward the cabin. The prints were too big to be animal tracks, and too irregular to be from someone wearing shoes. They were bare feet, leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. The tracks led right up to the door, and then, as if whoever had made them had simply turned and walked away, they disappeared into the trees. That was when I knew I wasn't alone out there. Whatever had been happening wasn't in my mind. Something had been watching me, and it was still out there. I didn't waste any more time. I ran back to my car and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back in town. Safe. The cabin was behind me now, but the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something still lingered. The isolation, the silence, the strange occurrences. All of it had been too much to ignore, and though I was safe now, I couldn't shake the thought that I would never truly forget the eerie quiet of that cabin in the woods. As I pulled into a gas station to refuel, I looked at the rearview mirror. The mountain road I had just traveled down stretched behind me, the dark trees whispering with the wind. I couldn't help but wonder who or what had left those footprints, and what it had wanted from me. I had always liked the idea of getting away from it all. The city, the noise, the people. It had become too much lately. So, when I found this old cabin in the woods through an online rental site, it seemed like the perfect escape. No phone service, no internet, just nature and peace. I could recharge and enjoy some solitude. It wasn't the prettiest cabin. It was rustic, with rough-hewn logs that looked like they hadn't seen a coat of paint in years. The windows were small and bordered by thick, overgrown trees, making the place feel even more isolated. But it was exactly what I needed. It was the kind of place that seemed perfect for long nights by the fire, reading and thinking. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The long, winding road to the cabin had been bumpy, and my old car had creaked and groaned the whole way. As I pulled up to the cabin, the surrounding woods seemed almost alive, the trees tall and thick, casting shadows on the ground. There was a slight breeze in the air, making the leaves rustle gently. A sense of calm washed over me. The cabin's front porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out. I grabbed my bag and made my way inside, the door opening with a heavy, groaning sound. The interior was exactly what I expected: wooden floors, a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace, and a couple of old, worn chairs scattered about. The place smelled of pine and earth, like it had been untouched for years. A fire pit in the middle of the room was surrounded by scattered logs. I threw some of the logs into the pit and set a match to get a fire going, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. Night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, staring into the flames. It was peaceful, yes, but there was something about the silence that started to feel a little too thick. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. But I brushed it off. It was just the woods. I'd heard that kind of thing before. People saying nature could make you feel like that. I told myself I was just tired. After a while, I went to bed. The cabin was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional crackle of the fire from the other room. But as I lay there, in the dark, trying to get some sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague unease. I could hear the wind picking up outside, howling through the trees. I pulled the covers up tighter around me, trying to ignore it. It was nothing. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a strange sound. It was faint at first, almost like a tapping. I opened my eyes, straining to listen. The tapping continued, quiet at first, then louder. It was coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be branches tapping against the windows, but it wasn't that kind of rhythmic tapping. It sounded deliberate, like someone knocking, but no one could be out there. There was no road, no neighbors, just the woods. I tried to ignore it, but the sound only grew louder. It wasn't just tapping now. It was like someone was walking around the cabin, stomping their feet lightly on the wooden deck. My heart started to race. I hadn't seen a single person for miles when I drove up, and I certainly hadn't heard anyone. I didn't want to go outside to check. That would be too risky. But I couldn't just lie there either, wondering. Slowly, I got out of bed, grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand. My fingers were trembling as I clicked it on. I moved cautiously through the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the wooden floors. The door creaked as I opened it a crack. I peeked outside, shining the light into the darkness. There was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. The wind had died down, and the forest around me seemed still. Maybe it was animals, maybe branches moving. But then I heard it again, the sound of something moving on the deck, right behind me, a shuffle of feet. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way I was imagining it this time. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was just the wind. I wanted to believe that, but the feeling didn't go away. Felt like I wasn't alone. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing sounds, soft thuds and shuffling. It felt like someone was pacing around the cabin, waiting, watching. My body was frozen, my mind racing. I wanted to get out of there, but where would I go? I was in the middle of nowhere. By morning, I hadn't slept. I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the woods and trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I didn't want to leave. There was nowhere to go. I had to stick it out. So I got up, made some coffee, and went outside to get some fresh air. The sun was up now, but the forest still had a strange, eerie feel to it. The cabin seemed more like a trap now than a refuge. As I walked around outside, I looked closely at the area near the door. There were footprints in the dirt, large ones bigger than mine. They weren't there the day before. Someone had been close to the cabin. I froze, staring at the marks on the ground. They led to the side of the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. Someone had been out there, someone who didn't belong. My mind raced. I was alone out here. No one knew I was here. What if they came back? I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to figure out what to do. The sound of footsteps, the tapping at the windows, the footprints. It was all too much. Something wasn't right. I decided to check the phone, but as expected, there was no signal. No one could reach me here. I was completely alone. I sat by the window watching the forest, but the trees were still. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long shadows over the ground. I had to get out of there. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things, threw them in my car, and locked the cabin door behind me. I drove away quickly, not looking back. The road seemed endless, and the forest around me felt like it was closing in. But as I reached the end of the long driveway, I noticed something strange. There, just on the edge of the woods, was a figure standing. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could tell they were watching me. I hit the gas and sped off, not daring to look back. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered as I drove faster and faster. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Eventually, I made it to a small town. I stopped at a diner to catch my breath and grab some food. The whole time, my mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. As I sat there, I heard a conversation at the table next to me. A couple was talking about a cabin in the woods that had been abandoned for years. It was in the same area I had been. They said it had been empty for a long time, but that people had gone missing around there before. They'd never found out why. I didn't stick around long enough to hear more. I paid my bill and left. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was at that cabin wasn't finished with me yet. That night, I slept with the lights on in a small motel room. My phone still had no service, but I didn't care anymore. I was just happy to be out of that place. I didn't look for answers, and I never went back. Whatever happened there was better left forgotten. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of footsteps on the porch, the tapping at the windows, and the feeling that someone or something is still out there waiting. I've always enjoyed the quiet of the woods. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the distant chirp of crickets, and the smell of damp earth that brings peace to my mind. But that peace shattered the moment I arrived at the cabin. I wasn't planning on staying in the cabin initially. It wasn't even my idea to come out here. My friend, Dave, had rented it, claiming it was the perfect getaway from the stresses of city life. He said it was isolated, away from the noise and distractions of the modern world. Honestly, I should have known something was off when he said it was a fixer-upper. But I wanted to get away from the grind, so I agreed to go along with it. It's not like I had anything better to do. The cabin was hidden deep in a secluded part of the forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor, and certainly far from any roads or signs of civilization. The air grew heavier the further we drove, like the trees were leaning in closer with every mile. The drive itself was exhausting, narrow, twisting roads that seemed to lead nowhere. But eventually, we arrived. The first thing I noticed when we pulled up was how old the cabin looked. It was a small structure made of weathered wood, with a steep roof that appeared like it had seen many harsh winters. The surrounding forest had encroached on the cabin, the underbrush thick and tangled, with trees reaching so close that their branches almost touched the roof. There was a sense of abandonment to the place, like it had been left untouched for years. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, that strange, unsettling silence that's impossible to ignore. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, but even that seemed too distant, too faint. Dave didn't seem to notice. He was already hauling bags out of the trunk, talking excitedly about all the character the cabin had. I followed him reluctantly, glancing over my shoulder as if something might be watching me from the woods. But when I looked back, everything seemed normal, just a dark stretch of trees and the eerie stillness of the air. We spent the first few hours inside, unpacking and getting settled. The cabin was as rustic as they come. No modern luxuries, just a couple of rooms with old furniture and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The smell of mildew and damp would fill the air, but Dave kept insisting it was part of the cabin's charm. I tried to shake the unease creeping into my mind, but the longer I stayed, the more I began to feel like something wasn't right. That night, after we ate and drank some beers by the fire, Dave decided to head out for a walk in the woods. I didn't really want to go with him, but I didn't want to sit alone in the cabin either. So we both grabbed our jackets and headed out, the darkness of the woods swallowing us whole as we walked deeper into the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting strange shadows on the ground, and the air had a strange chill to it. We didn't talk much as we walked, and soon, the sound of our footsteps was the only noise between us. It was oddly peaceful, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent a jolt of unease through me. But when I looked at Dave, he seemed totally unbothered, lost in thought as we continued walking. It wasn't until we were a little farther into the woods that I started hearing things. At first, it was just a faint noise, like a twig snapping in the distance. I stopped and turned toward it, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was an animal, but the longer we walked, the more the noises grew. It sounded like footsteps, soft and deliberate, following us. I asked Dave if he heard it, but he just shrugged it off, thinking I was just hearing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The footsteps followed us, always a step behind, never too close, but always there. I started walking faster, trying not to let it show, but my heart was pounding in my chest. We eventually decided to head back to the cabin, but as we made our way toward the clearing where we had parked the car, the sounds stopped. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I felt an odd sense of relief, but also confusion. What had I heard? And who or what was following us? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, kept me awake. I kept thinking about the footsteps in the woods, how they had followed us so quietly, and how they had disappeared without a trace. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. I told myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I couldn't shake the unease. The woods were silent again, but the air felt different now, heavy, like something was waiting. I didn't go far from the cabin, just enough to stand at the edge of the woods and look into the darkness. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting in strange shapes in the moonlight. That's when I saw it, a shape moving between the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could see it, slightly darker than the shadows, shifting slowly in the distance. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. I was certain I was seeing something, but it wasn't moving like an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I turned back toward the cabin, panic starting to rise in my chest. I started walking quickly, trying not to look over my shoulder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me. The door slammed behind me when I reached it, and I bolted it shut, feeling ridiculous, but also deeply unsettled. Dave was asleep when I went back inside. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring out of the window into the woods, half expecting to see something move again. The night dragged on in silence, the shadows outside remaining still and unyielding. The next day, I didn't want to leave the cabin, but Dave insisted. "It's just your imagination," he said, laughing. "It's a cabin in the woods, man. What do you expect?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we packed up to leave, I glanced around the cabin one last time, noticing for the first time just how abandoned it felt. There was nothing charming about it. It was just old and worn, and the woods surrounding it seemed to hold secrets that I wasn't ready to uncover. I don't know why I didn't say anything to Dave about what I saw the night before. Maybe I thought I was just imagining things. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel like something was still watching us from the woods, hidden just out of sight. I knew I'd never return to that cabin again.